Hello everyone, I'm Bob Varsha. Welcome to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and this Speed Vision look at the history and the heritage of the Formula One United States Grand Prix. Since 1911, the annual Indianapolis 500-mile race has made this the most famous racing circuit in the world. Then in 1994, NASCAR's enormously popular Winston Cup Series arrived, and since then, the Brickyard 400 has only added to the luster of Indy. Now fast forward to September 24th, 2000, and the long-awaited, much-anticipated return of Formula One racing, the revival of the U.S. Grand Prix after a 9-year absence. Since the early 1980s, Formula One, even when it raced in America, suffered a nomadic existence, moving from one temporary street circuit to another, never finding the permanent home that would allow it to become both an artistic and a financial success. The consensus seems to be that Indianapolis, with its instantaneous name recognition worldwide and its some 9 decades of racing tradition, is the one place that can host a contemporary Formula One race and rekindle the American racing fans' fascination with Grand Prix racing. Though Formula One's international spectator appeal and staggering marketing power have exploded worldwide, it has not caught on in America. But America's ambivalence towards Formula One has not always been the case. Throughout the 1960s and into the early 1980s, the U.S. Grand Prix was one of the highlights of the annual calendar. The tradition of Formula One in the U.S. has been dormant for the past few years, waiting to be revived. For the next hour, we are going to delve into the history of America's Grand Prix, look at significant events that happened here, and examine the causes for the successes and the failures of Formula One in the United States. The end of the 1800s brought with it the dawn of a new age, that of the automobile. Immediately, man's competitive spirit found a new form of sport. Serious automobile racing began with the French. They were the first to embrace the new invention, and their great races over the public roads, road racing in its purest form, brought national prestige and a booming auto industry. While road racing grew quickly in Europe, America's road races were comparatively minor affairs. That changed in 1904, when America made its first major contribution to international road racing with the running of the Vanderbilt Cup outside New York City on Long Island. Crowd control was always a problem, though, and a spectator's death in 1906 ended the days of cup races on public roads. June 26, 1906, a seminal date in the evolution of motor racing. The first event, called a Grand Prix, takes place at a small French town known as Le Mans.
The Great Grand Prix in France had originally been organised by the French because they had the biggest motor industry in the world, and they were really cheesed off with the regulations for the only international competition, which said that this was a competition for national teams of no more than 3 cars each.
Such was the strength of their automotive industry that the French fielded 20 teams for their Grand Prix. It immediately became the world's premier motor race. 2 years later, a new race emerged to emulate France's Grand Prix in stature, and it took place in the United States. On September 26, 1908, Savannah, Georgia hosted the first American Grand Prize. The entry list was almost as strong as its annual French counterpart.
The importance of the early American Grand Prize races was really that they gave an added dimension to the world's high-performance motor industry. All of those manufacturers regarded it as win on Sunday, sell on Monday.
Savannah was extremely popular. European veterans praised the course, its organization, and the hospitality of the locals. The second Grand Prize race in 1910 also created a new American hero.
From an American perspective, the most important character to emerge from the early Grand Prize races was really David Bruce Brown. He was a young man, 22, 23 years old. He really was the Mario Andretti, the American superstar of the day.
With Brown's second straight win at Savannah in 1911, American road racing's popularity and international prestige were at an all-time high. But that same year, another race took place that would have enormous ramifications for the future of road racing's popularity in America.
The Indianapolis Motor Speedway had trials and tribulations for those first couple of years, but the first Indianapolis 500 was a huge success. And I would say that it far overshadowed anything else that had gone before.
Throughout the second decade of the 20th century, the Indy 500 grew in stature. Meanwhile, political and organizational problems plagued the Grand Prix, which lost its luster as it moved from Savannah to other cities.
There was a split in the thinking about what was really motor racing. You know, the Americans didn't seem to have a great interest in road racing. They liked to sit in a grandstand and have the whole thing laid out before them and see great speeds and have the announcers tell them how fast everybody was going. The Europeans just didn't think that was motor racing.
By 1917, major road racing in the United States was finished. The sport's early growth in France and Europe had been greatly aided by the continent's vast system of centuries-old roads. The young United States had very little adequate roadways at this time. What the U.S. did have, however, was horse racing tracks.
Oval track racing started on fairgrounds tracks, which no other country in the world had, and they were of a dirt surface, and that's what the horse racing and trotting took place on. In Europe, the horse race tracks were grass, so there was a separation right there.
For Americans, racing cars on dirt ovals was a natural. They sprang up all over the country during the teens, 20s, and 30s.
Most of the great European road circuits were public roads, which would be simply closed for a race weekend. The promoters really were looking for some earnings to defray their costs, but above all, they were looking to promote their region or their area. They were sponsored by local government or by state government, national government. In America, the situation was completely different. With a closed oval circuit, you had an enclosed captive audience who could not see a darn thing unless they paid the promoter.
The differing attitudes and economic motivations of the Americans and Europeans, evident from the earliest days, would continue to define and shape the sport throughout the 20th century. The modern era of Grand Prix racing began in 1950. For the first time, the technical term Formula One appeared. It was the International Automobile Federation's designation for its premier category, that which crowned the world champion driver. From 1950 through 1958, the United States never staged a Formula One Grand Prix, but it did have a race on the World Championship calendar.
When it was announced that there was going to be this championship, and there was no Grand Prix at that time, the management suggested that surely the Indianapolis 500 should count as one of the events.
With only the occasional exception, the Grand Prix teams and drivers skipped the Indy 500 and concentrated on the proper Grand Prix races, as the relatively slow transatlantic travel of the day would have meant missing at least one European Grand Prix. Sebring, Florida, home of the 12-hour sports car race, was the first circuit to seriously attempt to get a U.S. Grand Prix. And in 1959, America finally had its first World Championship Formula One race. That first U.S. Grand Prix was won by Bruce McLaren of New Zealand, who at 22 years of age remains the youngest man ever to win a Formula One Grand Prix. The race decided the World Championship, Jack Brabham picking up his first title by pushing his car to fourth place. But drivers were bored by the airfield circuit. The rough surface destroyed the nimble but fragile Formula One machines, and the sight of a decimated field of cars circulating around a 5-mile track was hardly a spectacle to capture mass spectator interest. The race was not a success. The next U.S. Grand Prix went to the Riverside Racecourse in Southern California in 1960. The small crowd was treated to an exhibition of driving virtuosity by the master, Sterling Moss. But conflict between the organizers and the local press led to poor promotion and poor attendance, which made the Riverside race, like Sebring before it, a financial disaster. But in upstate New York, there was a road circuit that had been boldly establishing a strong reputation. Watkins Glen. A young sports car enthusiast who spent his summers there thought an automobile race would be good for the local economy.
In the fall of '47, I really was thinking about it, and my father and I discussed it at length, and he agreed that this should be an ideal situation for a community to get behind it because of extending the tourist season. All that winter, we designed a course. It certainly was modeled after and had many of the features of the Nürburgring.
Beginning in 1948, the sports car races through the village and along country roads around Watkins Glen captured the flavor of European road racing. They were great successes, not just aesthetically, they were financial successes as well. Local banks found themselves with $1 million in additional deposits on the Monday following race weekends. But once again, the dangers of racing on crowded public roads brought tragedy. After an 8-year-old boy was killed in 1952, racing had to move out of town to a private closed course until 1955. The event organization, led by Cameron Argetsinger, built a 2.3-mile circuit in 1956. Watkins Glen enhanced its reputation by running Formula Libre races. Each year from 1958 to 1960, crowds doubled and redoubled. By the time Sterling Moss won the 1960 race in his Formula One Lotus, the Watkins Glen management had endeared itself to the Europeans by being able to pay them in cash.
In the first Formula Libre race, the winner and a couple of the others asked if we could cash their checks because we paid them on the spot with checks. And we said, sure. They knew we kept our word.
Watkins Glen had proven its ability to effectively organize world-class races, pay the teams, and generate large spectator crowds. The corporation was given notice by the FIA that it had won the right to stage the 1961 United States Formula One Grand Prix if the race could be organized in just 6 weeks. After 2 failures, it became clear that America needed a run of consistent success in order to be considered a suitable venue for the Formula One World Championship. The stage was set for a tiny village in upstate New York to take its place alongside the likes of Indianapolis, among the world's great racetracks. When October 8, 1961 arrived, Watkins Glen was ready. Jack Brabham led from the green flag over Sterling Moss, with American Dan Gurney in the thick of the battle for the lead. Moss and Brabham swapped the lead throughout the first half of the race, but both retired. The winner was Innes Ireland, who charged through the field and gave Team Lotus its first ever Grand Prix victory. The drivers and teams were unanimous in their praise of the event, which was called an absolute triumph. With only 6 weeks' notice, the Watkins Glen Grand Prix Corporation succeeded where both Sebring and Riverside had failed. At last, the United States had found a suitable home for its Grand Prix. Throughout the 1960s, Watkins Glen would continue to grow in stature. From 1962 through 1967, the U.S. Grand Prix was dominated by the 2 most successful drivers of the era, Jim Clark and Graham Hill. The Glen was now firmly established as the spiritual home of the U.S. Grand Prix, and it had become more than just a sporting event.
There were a lot of campers, families. More and more, there were young kids. And it was happening in an event, and all the Eastern colleges certainly talked about going to the Grand Prix.
In 1965, Hill won his 3rd straight, and Watkins Glen won the Grand Prix Drivers Association Award for the Best Organized Race of the Year. In 1966, Jim Clark won for the 2nd time at Watkins Glen, and race organizers set a precedent by instituting a purse system rather than starting money. Instead of negotiating an appearance fee with each team, now teams and drivers would be paid based on finishing positions. It was a radical idea, but now the U.S. Grand Prix paid the most money of any road race in the world, over $100,000 in total purse, with $20,000 going to the winner. In addition to the high purse monies, the atmosphere at Watkins Glen made it one of the high points of the racing season.
On certain occasions in the fall, the colors in the trees still stand out as being just breathtaking. I don't care where you came from. And when you went there during that maybe a 2-week period in the fall, it was just fabulous.
Watkins Glen had simple charm. I mean, we went to parties at Cameron Argetsinger's home, he and his wife and his sons. Going to his house on the side of the lake for cocktails was pretty big time. It was the same sort of rare invitation you would get to go to the palace at Monaco. That was what it was like, but it was very natural, very relaxed, and just awfully nice.
Grand Prix racing was a simpler sport in the 1960s. There was a true sense of fraternity among the participants. Corporate sponsorship was limited to small contributions, mainly from automotive companies, and the sport was brutally dangerous. Jim Clark won his third and final U.S. Grand Prix at Watkins Glen in 1967. In April of the following year, the greatest driver of the era was killed in a Formula 2 race in Germany. The search for his successor was confirmed at Watkins Glen later that year.
The 1968 Grand Prix of the United States at Watkins Glen was the first time that I recognized that I had kind of taken over the mantle of Jim Clark. And at that race, for the first time ever, I realized that I had the respect of my peers in that if I went faster, the whole field went faster. If I slowed down, the whole field slowed down. They were prepared to follow whatever I did.
With his victory in 1968, Jackie Stewart became Jim Clark's heir. The decade ended with another win for Colin Chapman's Team Lotus, as Jochen Rindt scored his maiden Grand Prix victory in 1969. The purse had jumped to over $200,000, with $50,000, more than double any other Grand Prix, going to the winner. It had been a glorious decade for the circuit, and even greater stature lay ahead for Watkins Glen. But the 1970s would also see the beginning of its decline. '70 marked a turning point for the U.S. Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, the last race on the 2.3-mile circuit. After early domination by Jackie Stewart in his new Tyrrell, a 23-year-old Brazilian named Emerson Fittipaldi, driving in only his fourth ever Grand Prix, scored a stunning upset. Soon after the race, the Watkins Glen organization floated a bond issue, raising $3.5 million to lengthen the course, upgrade facilities, and improve safety measures. These changes made it one of the premier racing circuits in the world.
I loved the Glen when they extended the course. Then it became really a very technical course because you had really good elevation changes. Then you had a good variety of corners, the downhill braking, and I really, that's the Glen that I really appreciated.
Francois Sever won the first race on the newly configured 3.3-mile circuit, his first career Grand Prix win after shadowing his Tyrrell teammate Jackie Stewart early. And Watkins Glen won its second consecutive award for the year's best organized race. 1972 brought Stewart his second win at the Glen, leading Sever in a Tyrrell 1-2 sweep. And Watkins Glen increased its purse once again to over $250,000. The Tyrrell team came to Watkins Glen in 1973 in high spirits. Stewart had recently clinched his third world championship, while Sever had steadily matured, making him one of the drivers challenging to become Stewart's heir as the sport's top driver. Then came qualifying.
73 US Grand Prix was going to be my 100th Grand Prix, and it was going to be my last. It seemed a good way to end it on the end of my contract with Ken Tyrrell. And short of taking my own family, God struck down with all his force and took the life of Francois Sever, who was my teammate. And it was a horrendous accident. Just debris everywhere, and a vicious accident, brutal. It meant that, you know, what was to be a climax to a career that I had been so well rewarded for suddenly ended on the lowest note possible. And indeed I didn't race because Ken and I decided that it would be more appropriate in respect to Francois to withdraw the team and not to drive. So I never did my 100th Grand Prix. And of course all of that was at Watkins Glen.
On Sunday, Ronnie Peterson held off a young James Hunt in a magnificent race. But the previous day's tragedy had overshadowed the weekend. The next year saw the World Championship decided at Watkins Glen. Emerson Fittipaldi passed rival Clay Regazzoni in the first turn and went on to finish fourth, clinching his second world title. It was another sad day, however. 25-year-old Austrian Helmut Koenig was killed after slicing through the guardrail. The Glen wasn't blamed for these fatalities. Guardrail was the state-of-the-art safety device at the time. But the Watkins Glen Grand Prix Corporation was beginning to be troubled on a number of fronts. Once a site of good-natured fun created when the course was lengthened, the infamous bog had degenerated into a rowdy mud pit, creating a sport of its own, stealing and burning vehicles.
The bog didn't interfere with the racing, but it certainly was a cloud on the whole operation. And I don't know why it couldn't be cured, but it wasn't, and I'm sure they wanted to.
Far worse than negative publicity from the hooliganism of the bog was the unseen financial strain on the track from the crushing debt of the bond issue. Argetsinger had left the Grand Prix Corporation in 1970, but as executive director of the Sports Car Club of America, he was still close to the operation.
They borrowed almost exactly twice what they ever could reasonably hope to repay. They were financially pinched.
While Watkins Glen was struggling with its financial problems, Formula One was entering a new era. The sports leader, Bernie Ecclestone, was single-handedly turning it into a more professionally run organization. The casualness of the 60s was being replaced by demands to meet new standards of track safety and amenities. Watkins Glen was under pressure to change with the times. As the races continued throughout the second half of the 70s, complaints from drivers and teams began to be leveled at the track, which only a few years before had been so highly praised.
I think Formula One raced away from Watkins Glen. When the Formula One went there first, it was way ahead of everything else. But what happened then was that Formula One really started to get its act together with Bernie Ecclestone and so on. And suddenly other circuits came into play where the facilities were better. And then I think really the worst thing that happened was that the October date for the Watkins Glen race really started to tell, because the fall, when it was a nice day, it was the most beautiful place in the world up there. But when you had rotten weather, it was dreadful.
The 1979 race featured a duel between Gilles Villeneuve and Alan Jones. It was another excellent race. But that weekend, the political powers of Formula One and the international media raked the Watkins Glen organization over the coals for the condition and appearance of the circuit, the facilities, press working conditions, the ever-present rowdyism, and even the cold, rainy weather.
I knew that there was going to be a day of reckoning on the bond issue because of the debt service. I knew that the expenses were ever increasing with Bernie Ecclestone. But I would like to emphasize that Bernie Ecclestone didn't cause the downfall. It was the debt service on the bond issue.
The race survived only one more year. Alan Jones became the last Grand Prix winner at Watkins Glen. In 1981, the circuit declared bankruptcy. The new commercial and professional realities of Formula One had outgrown the small-town charms of Watkins Glen. The sport now demanded higher visibility and greater commercial leverage. There was one entrepreneur in America who understood the new commercial reality of Formula One. He lived in California, and he was about to change the image of the U.S. Grand Prix forever. While Watkins Glen was still operating comfortably as the home of the U.S. Grand Prix, a travel agent with an entrepreneurial spirit by the name of Chris Pook was working to sell the idea of a Formula One race through the streets of Long Beach, California. As with Watkins Glen, the purpose was to bring visitors to the area.
Unfortunately, Long Beach at that time was not unlike many other centers of American cities. It left a lot to be desired, let's leave it that way. So I went to the city and said, you know, look, you've got this dilemma. Here's a solution to solving it. You can spend millions and millions of dollars advertising Long Beach, and you can go the slow road to try and get your identity changed and bring in developers, or you can do something totally outrageous, as did Monte Carlo years before, and close your streets down for 3 days and run racing cars around them, and hopefully get television national and international. So we just copied what Monte Carlo did.
It took Puch 2 full years to get approvals from the many government agencies and various committees of the FIA. 11th-hour opposition from environmentalists nearly killed the idea. But in June of 1975, by a 6-5 vote, the final California governmental hurdle was cleared. 3 months later, the Long Beach Grand Prix circuit was christened with an SCCA Formula 5000 race with international media on hand.
None of us could quite believe Long Beach. I went to the first 5,000 race in November, October '75, and it was just such an imaginative concept to actually invent in a brand new street circuit. And it was a wild and woolly street circuit, of course. It wasn't billiard smooth, it was a real car breaker.
I think just the sheer romanticism and the thought of racing on streets really captured everybody's attention.
In April of 1976, the U.S. Grand Prix West, as it was officially called, became a reality. And the U.S. became the first country in 19 years to host 2 Grand Prix in a single season. Clay Regazzoni won the inaugural race over Ferrari teammate Niki Lauda. Long Beach broke new ground in circuit safety by being the first to use tire barriers, now the standard for racetracks around the world. Incredibly, in its debut year, Long Beach was given the award for Best Run Race of the Year. It was an instant artistic success, but
It was a financial disaster.
despite this, all but 3 of the track's 186 creditors and shareholders pledged continued support for the event. It's fortunate they did, because the next year, Long Beach gave Formula One one of its all-time classic races.
I started second and didn't have a very good start. Technically, Jody Scheckter was behind Lauda and myself, and here he goes into the lead. I mean, just really charged very aggressively, and I could give you the size of every bolt on the suspension, you know, of his car, because I mean, that's all I saw for the next hour and a half or 2 hours. And I was just trying to think where and how I was going to be, you know, to make my pass. It turned out perfect, because I think I surprised him more than anything.
It was one for the ages. For the first time, an American had won the U.S. Grand Prix, and it gave Formula One unprecedented coverage in the American media. But there was as much drama behind the scenes as in the race.
The 77 race got within hours of being canceled, absolutely. Cash flow was horrific. We had our bankers, our personal bankers there. We were arranging bank loans, putting second trust deeds on our houses to secure these debts.
The organizers managed to break even. In just 2 years, Long Beach had become one of the favorite races on the Grand Prix calendar, universally praised for both its upscale atmosphere and for its challenges.
As a driver, you had to be vigilant. You had to know. I mean, you could knock off a corner like a chunk of a wheel just by misjudging by an inch.
The nearest thing that we would have had as a comparison was Monte Carlo, and I felt that Long Beach offered more in some respects than Monte Carlo did, because at least you could overtake in Long Beach.
You had to be so precise there. I mean, no mistakes allowed.
It was a hard circuit because you had different surfaces as well. You went from concrete to tarmac and back again, so it was quite tricky for a car, and it was physically demanding as well.
Like Watkins Glen, Long Beach soon discovered the costs of staging Grand Prix races were escalating rapidly. Even as John Watson was staging an incredible charge from 22nd starting position to win the 1983 Grand Prix, the news at Long Beach was already filtering out through the paddock. This would be the last Formula One race at Long Beach. Chris Puch's organization was bringing in $7 million from the Grand Prix, but between operating expenses and Formula One's $2 million purse and transportation fees, Puch knew he needed help from Bernie Ecclestone.
We went to Bernard and said, Bernard, we can't continue. You know, if you want to help us, then we can go forward, but as such, we can't continue. And he understood, didn't like it, but he understood. And we made the decision in November of 1982 that 83 would be our last race.
When you look back at it, it seemed as though the Formula One brigade overplayed its commercial hand. Many people regard the loss of Long Beach as one of the very few occasions that Bernie got it wrong commercially.
Watkins Glen and Long Beach had both provided a solid home for the U.S. Grand Prix. But the 1980s saw 4 other circuits hold a Grand Prix event. Some were moderately successful, others dismal failures. In 1981, a new U.S. Grand Prix joined the championship, the now infamous race at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, which lasted but 2 years.
It was a typical parking lot course. The reason it didn't last is because really it didn't have, to me, it didn't even have any character for some reason. It just, there was something really missing there.
The purists were aghast that a Grand Prix circuit could be laid out around a parking lot. But the glitz of Las Vegas was a clear signal that commercialism was high on the agenda. Formula One wanted higher visibility. In 1982, Detroit was added to the calendar. It seemed a logical site, the home of the U.S. auto industry.
Everybody again came out, looked at the circuit, went, ugh. A grid system racetrack, stop-go in the heart of Detroit. So I said, look, this place is a dream for me, because I like music, I enjoy Motown, and to come to the heart of where the music is, the capital of Motown, was just perfect.
Though the racetrack may not have been a classic, John Watson's drive that day certainly was. He passed 12 cars en route to the victory. It was the first of 7 Grands Prix at Detroit, and although the track was moderately praised as good for a street track, it did have legitimate challenges.
The fact that Ayrton Senna dominated Detroit as often as he did was an indication of his talent and the difficulty involved at that particular circuit, because it was a very, very hard circuit. Physically demanding, required a lot of concentration. Slightest mistake, you touch a wall, rather like Monte Carlo, you touch a wall, you're out. And he always mastered it.
Ayrton Senna of Brazil. The city of Dallas, Texas held a round of the World Championship in 1984. The race was run in July of all months, and the 100-plus degree heat caused the circuit to disintegrate. K.K. Rosberg mastered the crumbling surface, which made the race more of a road rally than a Grand Prix, and the Dallas venue fell by the wayside after only 1 year. The streets of Phoenix, Arizona became host to the U.S. Grand Prix from 1989 to 1991, races that were perhaps most noteworthy for the pathetic attendance.
Somehow Phoenix didn't quite work. It didn't have the atmosphere. It didn't grab you as a place that hadn't, how can I put it, any soul in a sense. I always felt that Phoenix was never quite going to get off the ground in the way that Detroit did, and of course it didn't.
But there was one notable highlight of those Phoenix races.
John Alesi racing Ayrton Senna in 1990 at Phoenix, even if we didn't think Phoenix was the greatest place. That was motor racing in the raw, and even Senna was impressed with Alesi's impudence, shall we say, on the circuit.
Las Vegas, Detroit, Dallas, and Phoenix never generated mass public interest. These slow stop-and-go circuits never giving the thoroughbred Formula One cars the chance to demonstrate their awesome performance. The artistic failures of these races left the Formula One community wondering about America's suitability for a Grand Prix. Following these repeated failures, the U.S. Grand Prix disappeared from the World Championship after 33 years.
I always thought racing on one of those circuits almost to be an oxymoron for a Formula One car. They They were built, really designed to race at places like Spa.
They were non-events to a very large extent, whether it was in Las Vegas in a car park, for goodness sake, at Caesar's Palace, whether it was in Dallas in a minor street area, whether it was in Detroit.
The essence of Formula One is the majesty of road racing, and that's racing on a road circuit whose shape is decided by the geography of the site on which it stands.
Throughout the 1990s, rumors frequently circulated that somebody, somewhere, was trying to get the U.S. Grand Prix back on the schedule. Until Indianapolis's bid was accepted late in 1998, these hopes that Formula One would come back to America were annually dashed. There certainly are circuits in the United States that would be challenging and suitable sites, but staging a Grand Prix race today requires tremendous financial resources and carries with it substantial risk.
Formula One became very, very expensive to stage in the United States. With all of the good intentions, the organizers really could not make any money with Formula One.
Australia is wonderful at Melbourne, but it's, you know, it's basically underwritten by the city of Melbourne and New South Wales. The race in Malaysia is underwritten by the government, because these are tourist marketing opportunities that these countries and these cities can afford to put money into and justify. You couldn't do that in America. You'd have the suit for the misuse of public funds all over you like a cheap suit.
The American promoters expect, when they put big bucks up, to get big bucks back and in fact make money. Modern Grand Prix racing doesn't much do that for promoters. So I don't blame the American promoters for not wanting to do it, but it was a loss to Grand Prix racing.
Since Phoenix, there has not been the ability to put together a financial base in the United States to run a Formula One race, with the exception of Tony and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Really, from the early 90s, I've been pursuing this, and it's taken this long to finally come to terms with Formula One to bring the U.S. Grand Prix to Indianapolis, but it's been worth the wait.
Those terms include a staggering rights fee to host the Grand Prix. Although the Speedway won't say exactly how much, estimates are about $15 million annually. Add to that the multi-million-dollar investment needed to build a road circuit and ancillary facilities that meet Formula One standards, and it's easy to see why it took the vast resources of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to bring the Grand Prix back to America.
I know that Bruton Smith probably spent $150 million building Texas Motor Speedway, and I know that they probably spent $150 million building the track in Malaysia. So we made a fair capital expenditure here, upgrading our facilities, but we didn't spend as much as either of those facilities because we had much of the infrastructure here already, but we spent a good portion of that.
I want to know how he's going to make a profit. Or perhaps it doesn't matter.
Understanding Formula One today means understanding its economics and marketing power, which are mind-boggling. Budgets for the top teams are between $100 and $200 million a year. Multinational corporations ante up tens of millions of dollars just to be a part of the Formula One mystique.
I think possibly what America has never wrapped its mind around is just how big Formula One really is. And the global World Championship Series and the global TV audience that follows it over 16 or 17 races during an entire season is the Indy 500 and the Daytona 500 and the NASCAR Championship all aggregated together and multiplied by 5 or maybe 10. That's how big it is.
I can only tell you how big Formula One is by making the point that when Malaysia wanted a Grand Prix, the president of Malaysia, Prime Minister, came to Burnie, not the reverse, flew to be at Estoril 3 years ago when they were trying to hammer out a deal. Bigger than the politics of most countries, I would say.
I think an American Grand Prix would have enriched Formula One, but Formula One has just grown so phenomenally over the last 10 years that it's hard to ever say it's suffered. But a World Championship without a race in America really isn't a World Championship. So, you know, we're looking forward to Indianapolis.
The United States is the world's leading power and commercial power. And if we're not present, we're missing something serious in our lineup, in our makeup.
At the end of a 9-year absence, Formula One has finally returned to America. But one has to go back to the days of Long Beach nearly 20 years ago to find the last time the U.S. Grand Prix was an event that was universally popular with participants and fans. In those 2 decades, both the country and the sport have undergone dramatic transformations. And so while the Formula One community and its North American fans are excited about a return to the States, the question remains as to whether Formula One as a show can maintain that fan excitement in the future.
The important year for me is going to be next year. Will the people that come in the year 2000 come back in the year 2001? And if they do, if they like what they see this year, then we're up and running. If they don't come back next year, I think the US Grand Prix's got a problem again.
I am aware of the fact that Formula One has to prove itself in America. They have a lot of auto racing out there with NASCAR and with Champ Car and IRL. Formula One is a very different way of going racing. We know from Montreal that we have good North American support, but how are we going to go down in Indiana?
America's got its own racing series, and with a bunch of races in America with American drivers and American cars and so on. So it's going to be very, very difficult for F1 to be big in America. It will have only one race with no American drivers and not much that's American in it. So it's going to be very, very difficult.
Formula One is a completely different animal than any other form of homegrown motorsport. Its level of sophistication puts it in a class of its own.
It is absolutely and unequivocally the highest form of automotive engineering anywhere. I would say some of the engineering, not just automotive engineering, some of the aerodynamic work and computer work they do in Formula One is probably superior to the best fighter plane out there. So if you want to see what human beings are capable of doing when it comes to a car, you need to go to a Formula One race.
The Formula One fan is it's not just interested in paint jobs, flashy paint jobs. It's a fan that's interested in the technical side of the sport. And there's so much more complexity to Formula One. And the average race fan, you know, doesn't totally understand that. It's a very specialized fan base, but it's strong. I think the fan base is stronger than a lot of people think in the United States.
Grand Prix racing has always been at the pinnacle of automotive engineering. Ironically, that aspect of its appeal is now a big problem. The race car's advanced aerodynamics has made close quarters racing very difficult, and therefore overtaking is an infrequent occurrence. This has brought heavy criticism. Those within the sport know they have to put on a good show if they hope to attract the American masses and grow beyond their current core group of devoted fans. Watkins Glen and Long Beach both proved that under the right circumstances, Formula One could thrive in America. They were more than just racetracks. They evolved into happenings in their own right, with an atmosphere and personality that transcended the race event. Indianapolis, with its rich heritage of open-wheeled racing, brings its own unique personality to the U.S. Grand Prix.
To get a big American crowd, Indy is definitely the best place because it's probably the only place in North America where you have race fans, whatever racing it is.
The US Grand Prix was an absolutely integral part of the Formula One global fabric. By going back to America, Formula One is correcting a major error. We need to be in America, and it's the right place to be, because Monaco Grand Prix, Le Mans and Indianapolis are 3 most important names in international motor racing. It absolutely is the right place.
Indy has magic to it. Something always magical happens at Indy. And the US Grand Prix will be no different.
And so the latest chapter in the history of the United States Grand Prix is now being written. To be sure, Formula One has changed beyond all recognition from those simpler days in Sebring, Florida, Riverside, California, and Watkins Glen, New York. But Formula One remains what it has always been. The most sophisticated racing cars in the world, built by some of the most skilled technicians, driven by brave men with one goal in mind, as it has always been, the right to be called world champion. The U.S. Grand Prix is truly a heritage reborn. From the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, home of the world's most famous yard of bricks, I'm Bob Varsha for Speed Vision.